On July 11, 2009, the UFC would put on one of its most profitable UFC cards, being UFC 100. It saw the return of Brock Lesnar and a rematch against Frank Mir. It also featured a grudge match between Michael Bisping and Dan Henderson and another title fight with GSP and Thiago Alves. This is a retro review leading up to UFC 300, and we are going to start off at the classic being UFC 100. This is the Fight Entertainment Index. Now, before we get to the main card, there's a couple things I wanted to point out from the prelims, and that is a fight between Shannon Gugarty, Matt Grice, and Tom Lawler and CB Dalloway. Both really good submission finishes that we got. I was like, wow, those would be 10s. Very fast, quick chokes, both guillotines, and I thought that was impressive. We also had a fight from young John Jones against Jake O'Brien, where Jake O'Brien actually took the first round, but then John Jones came back, boom, guillotine choke again. And then you have Mark Coleman, who was about, I want to say like 40 something at the time, comes in and defeats a young, late, unfortunately, Stephan Bonner. And pretty much the way that fight went was Stephan Bonner did pretty good in the first round, but then he couldn't stop the takedown leading into the end of the fight. The second two rounds were pretty much for Mark Coleman, and in an upset, he ended up beating him. But with that being said, let's move on to the main card, because that's what we're here for. Fight card started off with Yoshihiro Akiyama and Alan Belcher. He came from Osaka. Alan Belcher making his way out of Biloxi, Mississippi, and that was a good fight. And pretty much the fight went in a way where it was a little interesting. Like, the fight started off pretty even between the two on the feet, but they both ended up knocking each other down in the first round, which made the first round relatively even between the two of them. Leading into the second round, Akiyama caught a leg kick and then eventually got a takedown. For the most part in this fight, Akiyama was the more dominant person on the ground. Then even in the third round, he ended up getting a takedown and a knockdown. And I scored both of the last two rounds for him. The commentary had made mention that Akiyama maybe might have got the win, or maybe Alan Belcher did. They said that the fight was a little bit closer than I had thought. And maybe watching the fight live, like, they were right for thinking that. But in retrospect, I gave the fight to Akiyama, and then I eventually gave the fight a 7. It wasn't a bad fight at all, and it showed the talent of both of those fighters. And it was also a good showing and a good way to start the card. The next fight we had was Michael Bisping versus Dan Henderson, and this is a classic fight for anybody who has happened to see it. This is both of those fighters coming off of the Ultimate Fighter Season 9. If I'm not mistaken, that was the US versus UK season. It's pretty much billed as a grudge match between Dan Henderson and Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping, at the point in time in his career, was talking a hell of a lot of shit. And, you know, Dan Henderson was kind of known to be like the star from Pride, or at least one of them that came over in the UFC. And this is more or less the conclusion of that Ultimate Fighter coaches fighting each other type thing. The first round, we saw Dan Henderson clearly was coming in trying to land the strong punches. He was rushing Michael Bisping and trying to hit him with the right, clearly. Michael Bisping slowed down the action a little bit with a jab and kind of like was circling away, trying to make sure that he wasn't getting hit, but he ended up circling more towards the right hand, which ended up leading to the second round. In between rounds, Michael Bisping's coaches said, hey, don't circle towards the right hand. And if you keep on watching the fight, the second round starts, Michael Bisping circles a little bit too much, and then we see the legendary H-bomb connect with Michael Bisping's chin in one of the most brutal follow-up shots that probably is in UFC history. Land on Michael Bisping, knocks him out cold as ice, and that fight gets a 10. Dan Henderson is a legend, but that right hand is extremely legendary, and you saw why in that fight. And not only that, like, in a string of knockouts throughout Dan Henderson's career, that being like one of the first notable ones for a lot of UFC fans, if they weren't watching Pride, then yeah, like, that's a fight you have to see. Now, for the next fight, we had GSP fighting Thiago Alves. And for anybody who might be wondering, there is also a fight that isn't a title fight in here, but we ended up having this fight because of what the UFC said was time constraints. So they had the 2 title fights on next, and then somewhat of a dark match towards the end. It's like a dark match that was actually televised, but regardless, it was here, and GSP is coming in here to, as he says in the lead up to this fight, try to cement his claim as the pound for pound best fighter of all time in the UFC. Thiago Alves coming in as the hot prospect. I think has maybe at the moment the 3rd most leg kicks in the UFC, and he is looking to take GSP out and take the belt off at the welterweight division. That being said, this fight essentially was GSP's from beginning to end. I could go round by round, but for the most part, it's kind of rinse and repeat. Throughout the fight, GSP gets 9 takedowns. Not to say that Thiago Alves doesn't land any good strikes. He ends up landing a decent few leg kicks, but GSP is also standing in there with him. If I'm not mistaken, in the 5th round, he lands a good Superman kick, a leg kick, Superman punch combo, and then pretty much takes him down and works him on the ground whenever he can. Thiago Alves gets up and he does fight as much as he can, but GSP is just very dominant. Between one of the rounds, GSP is talking to one of the 4 fantastic coaches he has in his corner, and he says, "Hey, I think I pulled my groin. And Greg Jackson gives the classic quote of, "Hey, nothing else matters at this time. Hit him with your groin." Some wild shit to say to a dude in the fight with another dude, but here we are. GSP won the fight. I would give the fight, like, I think every fight was every round was a 10-9 round for GSP at the least. And I gave that fight a 7. This leads us to what would have been the main event between Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir. Actually, a rematch. Before this fight, Frank Mir had beat him with a knee bar, and Brock Lesnar actually came back and won the belt in the meantime. That being said, Frank Mir had just beat Nogueira for a title shot, and he was looking to prove that he was better than Brock Lesnar. And Brock Lesnar was looking to prove that that first fight was a fluke. And he looked like he was out for revenge in that fight. The fight started on the feet. Brock Lesnar caught him with a good punch and a good kick and then took him down. Frank Mir had no answer for the ground game of Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar looked to generate a lot of power out of what looked to be short punches and just really battered him up. It's crazy because, like, if you see the fight, it's not like the punches look like they're the most devastating punches you've ever seen, but if you look at Frank Mir's face, they do look like they're devastating punches. The second round was essentially more of the same. Starts out on the feet. Frank Mir catches Brock Lesnar with a couple knees, but then they get down to the ground. And in the words of Brock Lesnar, he took the horseshoe out and beat him over the head with it in the second round. He really just messed him up. And it looked like he really had a point to prove, or he really wanted some revenge. Beat him up, ended the fight. I gave the fight a 9. I was like, whoa, like, it is actually like quite impressive that he was able to do that, especially in retrospect, knowing that Frank Mir was like the more MMA fighter of the two, and Brock Lesnar was what a lot of people consider to be like an attraction fight. So it was interesting to see, and I liked it. The last fight of the night we had was John Fitch versus Paulo Thiago. For the most part, I would say that this fight wasn't that interesting, if I'm going to be honest. It was more or less of a ground game exchange between the two of them. Paulo Thiago and John Fitch were battling for the ground game and seeing who can have the more advantage in position. But for the most part, John Fitch was able to get the good positions throughout the fight. Not to say that Paulo Thiago wasn't able to reverse certain positions, but even when he was able to get like out of certain positions or back to his feet, John Fitch was able to get the takedown, or he was able to get mount, or he was able to take his back. He was able to do what he had to do in order to get to the end of the fight and get the win. And I thought that was great, but it didn't make for the best fight. I gave it a 6. I was kind of like, oh, okay, well, it sucks that they had to come on after the main event being Brock Lesnar and Frank Mir, because like maybe if it was on when it was supposed to be, it might have been looked at in a better way. But after that, it was kind of deflating for the card. So overall, the card wasn't bad. This is one of the UFC's probably most famous fight cards they ever put on, with some names that people won't ever forget. The Dan Henderson knockout, people won't ever forget that. GSP was the man at the time, and Brock Lesnar, being kind of a sideshow attraction, went in and proved some people wrong. Probably, definitely Frank Mir, because I'm sure he didn't see that shit coming. That was crazy. But regardless, we will be back and doing this again. UFC 200 is next. You might see me review another card. You probably already seen me review a card this year, but we're gonna be reviewing some more. So stay tuned, y'all. We'll be back, and we will be talking more MMA. So have a good one. Peace.